I'm going to take a seat. I'm honored to introduce to all of you, as if she needs an introduction, Tina Descovich, the co-founder of Moms for Liberty, bona fide hate group leader. Come up on stage. And next, we have James Lindsay, who needs no introduction. The Southern Poverty Law Center gave him a military title. They called him General Hate. And finally, we have Sarah Parshall Perry. She is now with Defending Education. I worked with her briefly at Heritage. She is a firecracker for truth and justice, especially on all things in the law. So I want to turn first to you, Tina. We hear so much about all the excellent work that Moms for Liberty has done, but I want to know, what the worst thing you've experienced from the Southern Poverty Law Center is.
Receiving the title of hate group for Moms for Liberty members is ultimately the worst thing that's happened to us, and it's hard sometimes to pinpoint what's fed off of that. But I can tell you, from the time we were added to the hate map, within days was our national summit in 2023 in Philadelphia. Thousands of protesters showed up within days, hateful protesters. We had to have all of Philly PD on duty, shoulder to shoulder, keeping us protected. We had to have riot gear police and the big vehicles you don't even know what the names of these things are. It was so intimidating just to keep us safe. They smashed in the windows at the Museum of Revolutionary War. They spray painted over Washington crosses the Delaware. That was all the immediate impact. Anonymous, the national, international cyber hacking group, they put the dark masks on, came out and took down our website, which, at that point, we were so early on, our website was built by me on GoDaddy, I think. And so, they spent millions of dollars coming after us to take down our website. And then, what we had to try to invest just to get it back up for Summit. We had President Trump that year. But the long-term repercussions that we've seen, like our moms go to book a restaurant for a meeting, and I'm sorry, you're an anti-government extremist group. We can't accept you here. Like that's disheartening for them. They're trying to have conversations about curriculum in their schools, and they can't do it because they have this label.
Yeah, and I think, just taking a breath and saying, and this audience doesn't need to hear it, but your response to, I remember first they had an article comparing the parental rights movement to the Uptown Klans of the 1960s that were opposing Brown v. Board of Education. But just briefly, if you could explain why the SPLC is so off the reservation on this.
We are joyful warriors. This is the Joyful Warrior National Summit. We are first, yes, exactly. Give yourselves a round of applause for that. And the category, and I think everybody's probably going to talk about the categories that you're under, because it's not just a hate map. They actually give you more labels and titles they stick on you. And Moms for Liberty is under the title of an anti-government extremist group. We have gotten over 500 people elected to school boards. That's not anti-government. 100 bills signed into law in 22 states. That's not anti-government. It's using our form of government to advance our values and principles, and it's the most American thing you can do.
Yeah. Amen to that. James, the SPLC is a big fan of yours. I was just looking over your extremist profile this morning.
It's really funny. It's like the funniest thing on the internet.
So they acknowledge that you might be one of the people who was demonizing people on the left and calling them groomers because they want to make our children a little bit more vulnerable to some horrible things. Would you care to respond a little bit and maybe thank them for your promotion to general?
Yeah, so they don't know how to categorize me. I'll tell you a few things about the SPLC and my fun relationship with them. They didn't know how to categorize me, so my categories are general hate and anti-government general. So I did a podcast and thanked them for the titles. I was going to send them a thank you note, but I didn't care enough to buy a stamp. So at any rate, they didn't know how to categorize me. The story of how I actually got on the list, I'm almost positive, it's not quite clear, but it appeared early in the year in 2023. I had spoken at the 2022 America Fest with Charlie Kirk. In fact, I took the stage, Tim Poole did a show, his Timcast show, that evening live, and it was me and Charlie Kirk and Tim's crew and Steve Bannon. And so, you know, this has got eyeballs on it, and I actually started talking about this particular issue. And in fact, this is where I came up with the infamous phrase, drag Floyd. We're all used to, we know what George Floyd meant. Well, I said, you know, that they're doing these extraordinary provocations with the drag queens in front of children, and they're doing them in states like Idaho, particularly, Texas. And it's not that hard to put together what they're trying to do. It's a provocation. And I went through this book called Beautiful Trouble, which is one of the activist guides based on Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. And I said, I think they're trying to provoke an incident where somebody does something crazy, so when some conservative does something crazy against a drag queen, and we're gonna have a drag Floyd explosion like we did with George Floyd, and they're gonna advance the ball. Media Matters had an article written about that before I got off the stage. They were not happy, and then I appear a few weeks later on the SPLC hate thing. They make a profile for me. I said it's the funniest thing on the internet. The first they just kind of profile me a little bit. The first thing after that they talk about that I did was that I made jokes about George Floyd on January 6th. Yes. No kidding. This is what they thought was the most important thing to put at the very top of my article, because that January 6th, I had forgotten I did this. I was just having a lark, you know, it's January 6th, 23, and I'm just sitting there and I'm like, you know, if you're a good Democrat and fight for justice, then the spirit of George Floyd will bring you presents on January 6th, miss, like he's Democrat Santa Claus. And I forgot I had done this, and the SPLC thought this was like the most important thing ever. I had somebody actually literally sent me a bottle of wine or something as a present, and it showed up on January 6th, and I'm like, look, I got a present in the mail because I fight for justice for George Floyd, because I want to shut down fentanyl across the border, which would be real justice for George Floyd's death. So anyway, they're not very happy with me. And it's really, I mean, it's kind of hilarious. They, of course, mischaracterized me. They said things like that I believe in the white genocide theory, which was actually based on some tweet somebody else said about something I said that they took out of context. I never promoted any of this nonsense. But, you know, we all laugh. I heard yesterday the SPLC came up and everybody in here cheered, and I think that happened again this morning. And they're like, we're proud to be on this list. And I'm like, yeah, and we are, because it means that we've been effective. You take the most flack when you're over the target. However, like Tina said, this has real world consequences because the world is stupid. And I'll just tell you two things for me. I got invited at one point. It was a little tangential, so I don't want to overfig the pudding on this story, but I got invited to testify before the US Senate. And it was going to be about gender ideology. Technically, the thing they were doing was about medical misconduct and malpractice, and so it was mostly about the COVID stuff, but I'd been invited by these doctors to testify, and so I had written about the trans thing, which is what they wanted me to write about. Senator Johnson liked my testimony from what I hear, but I did not get invited to testify. And when I just kind of asked why, I didn't talk to the senator about this, but I'm asking why afterwards for my contact, you know, and they said, well, you know, it's a little tangential to the subject, but most importantly, because it's not like mainline COVID stuff, and you have this SPLC profile, we knew the Democrats are just going to grill you on that the whole time, and it might derail the whole testimony. So I did not get the opportunity to testify in the US Senate because this profile would be misused by the Democrats as though it's authoritative. Secondly, I had the opportunity to go down and speak at the annual general meeting for the ACT Party New Zealand, for the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand in July. Don't go to New Zealand in July, it's winter. And it rains off of the ocean in very cold sheets all day. But I go, and the main protest, New Zealand Antifa, protested me they didn't know anything about me, and I'm an American. They protested me based on the fact, and they protest to this day the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand for inviting me, based on the fact that I have an SPLC hate profile. So this stuff has global repercussions, because even though the organization's in disarray now, it has a massively good reputation with left-leaning people and middle-of-the-road normies who think it's a legitimate organization rather than a communist front. So it's a bad thing that this happens, as funny as it is.
Well, and as I say, you know, the line between woke and based runs through every major institution, I think especially churches. And we see so many Americans who don't know that the SPLC should be a punchline. And I get Google News alerts for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and every day I get one of these, oh, in lieu of flowers, you know, X person has died, so if you want to honor their memory, give to the Southern Poverty Law Center. It makes my heart, it breaks my heart to see those. But, you know, I think we couldn't get almost better than Sarah Parshall Perry on this. You joined the Family Research Council shortly after, and I think this is something the legacy media has buried.
Yeah.
So if we could share again what happened, what are the concrete, you know, we've heard cancellation, we've heard protests, but there was something even worse that happened to the Family Research Council.
Yeah, I have the great honor distinction of having been targeted by the SPLC, and not one, not two, but 3 different organizations in Washington, D.C., as I've sort of maneuvered through the career ranks, so I consider that a badge of honor. But my first experience in Washington was a year after the Floyd Corkins shooting, when that individual, who was armed with a number of Chick-fil-A sandwiches and multiple rounds of ammunition, came in with the intention of slaughtering the entirety of the Family Research Council staff because of their opposition to same-sex marriage in light of what we saw would be eventually the Obergefell decision in 2015. He came in, he wrestled with the security guard, Leo, who is a tremendous man. Leo Johnson and I are still in contact with one another to this day. He took a bullet to the shoulder and he was incapacitated for the better part of 6 months, but he was able to wrestle the gunman to the ground. It was at that point that I realized political discourse in Washington, D.C. had reached a fever pitch. And when you realize how long ago that was now, and here we are in 2025, and the world watched a public execution on a public university campus in front of thousands of people in his vicinity and millions more online, that is exactly where we are. The affiliation with the SPLC and actual violence cannot be separated. You know, James mentioned Saul Alinsky's Rule for Radicals in his 1971 book. One of the things he mentioned was a 4-part tactic, and this is exactly what the SPLC employs. You pick the target, you freeze the target, you personalize the target, and you polarize the target. And that is exactly what the SPLC does. They pick us first, they freeze us, they remove us from common discourse, from the pluralism that the American founders promised to us as Americans, that our founding documents found and determined to be the most appropriate way of governing a society of multicultural, multi-ideological individuals, and you remove us from common discourse and from the public square, and then you personalize us with attacks based on the fact that we are hate groups, or racist, or fascist, or anti-fascist, or whatever it may be, and then you personalize it. And that is something, when we've been polarized, we are frozen in time. That is what the SPLC does. They take these essential freeze-dried talking points and they regurgitate them over and over again. So I was tagged, once I went to the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, as being a hate group leader appointed to chair the Employee Equity and Inclusion Council, which I think was an epic troll by Donald Trump under 45. I think it was hilarious that he picked somebody from the FRC to actually helm the DEI office, and what everyone eventually learned was that my type of diversity was intellectual diversity, and we weren't going to have iconoclasts and Ibrahim X. Kendi book clubs on the government dime. So the diversity that I wanted to institutionalize was diversity of belief, diversity of thought, but we weren't going to play politics with race anymore. So that was the second time I was tagged. Now, of course, as Vice President of Defending Education, we have just shown up as recently as June of this past year as an anti-student inclusion group. Why? Because we happen to oppose things like, oh, I don't know, racial affinity groups, or racially segregated classes, which we just discovered in Minneapolis public schools and which prompted the filing of a federal civil rights complaint yesterday at 10 p.m. These are the types of policies that we have to be guaranteed in public education. We don't want race-based programming. We don't want students to be pushed through a matrix of oppressed and oppressor, victim and victor. We don't want communist ideals, Marxist ideals infiltrated into the classroom. We want high-quality, value-neutral education. That is what our organization is dedicated toward, and it should be the guarantee for every single parent in this classroom, no matter where you send your kids to school. The SPLC has forgotten, among many other liberal pundits, among them Becky Pringle, Randy Weingarten, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden, that kids don't belong to the government. They belong to their parents, and we're here to secure that.
So we're seeing an uptick in political violence, especially from the left. And I want to hear from Tina how you see this, what message you would have of encouragement to those who are concerned, and also, you know, to wake people up to what time it is, because I think many of us, many people may not take the threat as seriously as I think they might need to.
Yeah, I would say that even many in our organization, we laugh it off a lot. You know, again, a badge of honor. Charlie Kirk was placed on the SPLC hate list 2 months before he was murdered, assassinated. I want to make sure I use the correct terminology there. We don't want to water that down.
I'm pretty sure the guy will be convicted, but yeah.
You know, I don't know the guy, but he was placed on the hate list 2 months before. And so that's a wake-up call to all of us, the seriousness of being placed on that hate map. And I think that's one of the reasons it's impacting so many of us that are on that hate map so strongly. Just as a side reference, 2 months before that, Moms for Liberty drafted a letter to the White House asking them to, actually we asked President Trump to draft and write an executive order getting the SPLC to the point that federal agencies, because that's all that's within his purview, to stop federal agencies for using SPL as a reference point when when looking into organizations. Because under the Biden administration, we know that the SPLC went to the Biden White House 6 times leading up to designating Moms for Liberty as an anti-government extremist group. When you start pulling back the layers of what was happening with that organization and our federal government at the executive level, the DOE, the DOJ, the FBI, they were all working with the SPLC and what their designations were. That is so unbelievably dangerous. And so we drafted that letter, and thank goodness so many other organizations joined us. James joined us on the list. TPUSA Action was on the list. Alliance Defending Freedom, a lot of us that were on the list all signed this letter. And, you know, I don't know why Kash Patel and the FBI came out recently, but I think we should take some credit because we were pinging pretty hard up in the administration that something has to be done, something has to be done.
I think there was a lot going on, but that letter definitely encouraged them. And there are more letters too. We have letters to Benevity now, because this was a story I broke yesterday, where they're using the SPLC to screen potential recipients of corporate America employees giving to organizations. So they can't give to Moms for Liberty if you work at one of these Fortune, there are about 225 of the Fortune 1000 companies. I mean, it's everywhere. And I think, you know, we have to continually spread the message and let people know how discredited this organization is. Yeah, so James, I don't want to laugh too much, but you seem to have this great way of diffusing these attacks. And I want to hear more, like, I take it very seriously. I'm a very serious person. And I just want to know what leads you to approach it that way? And I love the mockery. I mean, it's just so fitting.
One of the things I've learned is that the best way to deal with a lot of this, at least psychologically for yourself, but it's also very effective for a watching audience and for your friends, is to lean in and try to make it funny. So they accuse you of something, you step into it, you turn it into a joke, so then it diffuses the power. It's sometimes very difficult to do this. I try not to respond to things until I can figure out how. So like accepting the title General Hate was an example of this. So I think that actually diffuses it. But at the end of the day, it does not solve the problem. It helps psychologically, it helps with the group. The problem, like Tina said, Charlie Kirk got put on this, all of TPUSA actually got put on this hate map 2 months before Charlie was shot, and that young man, to use Erica Kirk's phrasing for him, that young man said it was hate. That is what drove him to do what he did. That's what he said, it was hate. That's the word the SPLC used for Turning Point and for Charlie Kirk. So these things have consequences. So we can make it funny, and that's very helpful for our morale. It's very helpful for diffusing it. It's very helpful for people seeing how you handle these kinds of attacks, that you don't take them too seriously, that you can break the stress they put you under, the struggle session that it induces. But at the same time, we have to remember that it's only a partial solution. It doesn't solve the real problem. We've got to stand against this very dangerous rhetoric that we're hearing. We can't embrace this same kind of dangerous rhetoric. We've got to draw a sharp line between ourselves as principled, freedom-loving Americans and people that believe political violence is a solution to hate.
So I think we're about done with our time, but I want to get one more question into Sarah. Because she's a lawyer and because I've long believed the strongest weapon we have against the SPLC is defamation lawsuits that are rightly written, that are narrowly tailored. There's one in Georgia right now with the Dustin Inman Society. How would you say the best legal way to combat this smear factory is?
So there are really two approaches, and I hate to sound like a lawyer on this, but I'm going to sound like a lawyer for a second. There are very strong constitutional protections against free speech sort of impingement. We want people to be able to speak their minds. That's very, very clear. The Supreme Court's got 100 years of jurisprudence protecting what is the first among our freedoms in the Bill of Rights, and that's freedom of speech. But among those particular free speech provisions, the Supreme Court's recognized over and over again that there are exceptions, and among those are true threats or incitement to violence or what's called fighting words. You cannot, for example, yell fire in a crowded theater without thinking you are going to put the public at risk because there's going to be a stampede. Many of these tactics are what we are seeing employed in fighting the Students for Justice in Palestine encampments and all of the anti-Semitic protests we see post-October 7th on college campuses coast to coast. That is precisely the avenue, I think, that could be used here, that once we tie word with action, word with consequence, and we find one of those narrow exceptions to what the free speech provisions of the First Amendment actually protect, that is a way to actually approach this. In fact, Maajid Nawaz, who is a reformed Muslim, actually was successful in bringing a lawsuit against the SPLC for defamation and won a $3 million judgment about 10 years ago. So it is possible, but for defamation claims to succeed, they have to be based in what is patently untrue information. Now, here's the problem with a word like hate. Hate is subjective. Hate can be interpreted a variety of different ways, and that's why the SPLC has been successful for so long. You take a term like hate, and then you essentially foment all of your readers, your donors, the general public. You associate with the DOJ, you give them this information, you tell them to run with it, and the consequence down the line is that people like Floyd Corkins are empowered to be able to say, I found my target on the SPLC hate list, and this is now how I'm going to respond. I think the speech versus action nexus is getting stronger and more narrow. We are now seeing speech leading to violence. Charlie Kirk may have been a watershed, and it may give the Supreme Court in time pause to reconsider its First Amendment jurisprudence.
Well, thank you again so much.
Thanks,
Tina, James, and Sarah. Is there any other last word you would like to leave with the audience before we get out of here?
It's just time to discredit the SPLC.
Amen to that.